Hi, this is Jesper from Velocitypeak, and in today's X Particles tutorial, we're going to make this. So this is an animated volume, and then the crust is animating as well, on and off. And if you want to follow along, all the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. Okay, let's jump in. Okay, so let's start. Now on the timeline, I have 180 frames, and just have a few elements we'll use later on for rendering. But to start, let's add a sphere. And I'm going to call this sphere inner because we're going to have two. And I can leave the radius at 100. I'm going to up the segments to 64. And instead of the standard type, let's do icosahedron, so we have more of an even topology. And then let's duplicate this. And then this is going to be the outer. So sphere outer. And I'm going to make it ever so slightly bigger. So 101 for the radius. And I'm going to increase the segments. I'm going to double this to 128. And the reason I want to have a lot of segments on this outer sphere is because I'm going to add a vertex map. And vertex maps are resolution dependent. So that's why. And we also need to make this editable. So let's do that. We can either hit C on the keyboard or just hit this button here. So now this is a polygonal object. Now I'm going to hide the sphere inner for now. We don't need to see it. We can come back to this later on. But I do prefer to have them below the extra files here. Okay, so to generate a vertex map is as simple as going to the select menu, and I have polygons, the polygon mode enabled, and I go to select, set vertex weight, leave the value at 0 and click OK. So now we have a vertex map. In fact, let's call this one texture driver, like so. And we'll come back to this when we texture later on. In fact, before that, we're gonna add a wet map later on to this, but that's for later. Now let's add an XP system and pull that below. So what we're going to do now is I want to add particles to the outside of this sphere. And then we're going to have an infectio modifier that are going to infect some of the particles. And the way the infectio works, or one way that it works, is that it can work with the color of the object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a noise texture to this sphere, and that's going to be the basis for infectio later on. So let's do that. Let's add a material, double click in the materials manager, and let's call this one noise mat. And I'm going to put that on the sphere. And let's hide the line, so NC for quick shading. And to make sure we see the texture, we can hit NQ or go to options and make sure in materials is enabled. And let's go into this material and uncheck reflection. And in the color channel, I'm going to add a noise. And I think I turned off materials. There you go. Okay, so let's go into the noise. And actually, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the texture tag. And instead of the UV mapping, I'm going to set this to be a frontal mapping. In fact, let's do flat mapping. And I'm going to set it to be seamless. But I'm going to bring up the scale a lot. So instead of 100 for the global scale, I'm going to do 600 for the scale. So you can see anything. We have a hint of gray here. So I'm going to increase the contrast a lot. So I'm going to bring up the low clip to around 30 or so. And bring this down to around 90. And I'm going to go even higher. I'm just going to bring up the contrast to 50. So we pretty much have white or black and just a little bit of gray in between. So it looks like this. And this is what's going to generate how the infection looks. So you can certainly play around a lot with this to get very different looks, but this is going to be the main generator. So I don't need to see the material anymore. So I'm going to hit NQ to hide it. And then I'm going to go to the emitter. And under the object tab and the emitter shape, let's do an object. And the object is going to be the outer sphere. And the whole reason we set up the texture so we can use the texture option. And then we get a texture tab. So let's go there and let's pull in this texture. And then let's also go to the emission tab, and the emission mode, instead of rate, let's do shot. And I want a lot more, so let's do 20,000. And I don't want any no speed, so let's set speed to 0, and I'm gonna leave radius to 3. So if I play this back now, let's just see what we get. So I don't know how well you can see on this recording, but let's go to display, and instead of dots, let's do circle, and then let's play this back. Okay, so this is what it looks like, and you can clearly kind of see there we don't have anything here. These are the black areas, and these are all the white areas. So now let's add, under modifier, let's go to control modifiers, and let's add xpInfectio. Now, xpInfectio needs something that can kind of seed it, that can start the infection. So what we can do is that we can add a new seed object, and that creates a separate object, which we can't see because it's in the middle of the sphere. But if I pull this down, and let me make this a little bigger, I'm going to make the size 37. So I'm going to place it around there. So this is the origin point, and this is where the infection is going to spread from. And let's just see what it looks like. If I play this back now, we're going to get something. And you can see that by adding this texture, the infection looks a lot more interesting. It doesn't go here. It just goes in the areas where we have white. And we have a fairly large noise now, so if you made it smaller, you will get many more little pockets. But obviously you can play with that, but this is what I want. So I'm also going to go back to the infectio now, because what I want to do is I want to use these colors, the infected and the incubating areas or particles. I want to create groups for them. So one way we can do that is by go into the color mode. Instead of fixed value, we can switch this to use groups. And then we have two slots, one for the incubating and one for the infected. And then if I add group now, if I click add group, it's going to select a new group. But if I just want to add it and not have the new group selected, I can hold down Control or Command. So you can see that it created two groups for us here. So let's call this red one. This is the infected. So infected. And this is the incubated. Incubated, like so. And I also want to pull them into the group null here. So now it's not going to look any different. But now that we have them as individual groups, in fact, they do look a little different because of the editor display mode. But for all sakes and purposes, they do the same thing. But by having them inside of groups now, we can now tell modifiers to include or exclude certain groups only, which is what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to go back to the XP emitter, and I'm going to go to the display and set it back to dots. And for the particle group, the infected particle group, I'm going to switch the color from the red one. I'm going to do gradient random. And I'm just going to make this black to white, a black to white gradient, so we can color this with Cycles 4D later on. So let's make this guy black, like so. And let's also have some speed. So I'm going to do 50, and then a variation of 20. And then let's do a radius of 0.75 and a variation of 0.75. Now, this infected particle group is the only group that we're going to render later on. So the rest really doesn't make a difference. Like this incubated group doesn't really make a difference in terms of rendering. So if I play this back now, this is what we have. Now, obviously, I don't want them to leave the sphere like this, and this is because we added the speed to the particles. So I want to make sure that they stick to the surface. So let's go to modifiers and go to motion modifiers, and then let's add XP follow surface. And what do we want it to follow? Well, the sphere outer. So let's drag that in. And we're going to do a pull 100%. That's essentially the strength of this. So if we play this back now, this is what we have. So now it follows the sphere. Now I also want to direct them. I want the particles to do something once they are born or once they are infected. So one way that we can do that is we can use the flow field. So if I go to dynamics and then I say flow field, I zoom out here a little bit. Now let me bring down the size. The smaller we can make this, the quicker it's going to be in the viewport. So say something like that. And you can tell what's going to happen by looking at the arrows. They're pointing in a certain direction. Now, if I play this back, and actually before I do that, when I go to groups affected, and I want to make sure that I drag in the infected particle group. And I want to make sure that I did that for XP follow surface as well, like so. So now, what do we get? So we get some movement. It's not strong enough, and it's going in the wrong direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this, and I'm going to rotate this. R for rotate. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees straight up, like so. And I'm also going to increase under the Object tab. I'm going to make the cell size around 22. And I'm going to increase the strength to 43. Now, the cell size is essentially the resolution. So the more arrows you have, the higher the resolution. And it works in conjunction with the strength. So we can also go into display and just turn off the show vectors because they get a little distracting. So now we're going to see that they're going to move outwards. Like so. But I also want to introduce some randomness into this so that they're not just going upwards. I want them to go in all kinds of directions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this. So let's call this one direction. And control drag this to make a copy. And let's call this one random. And in the second one, under the general tab, I'm going to increase the resolution somewhat to around 16, 17. And the flow, instead of default here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a shader. So if you use a shader, we can now use a noise shader. So I'm going to go into the shader and I'm just going to add a noise. And I'm going to leave pretty much everything exactly as it is in the noise shader, except I'm going to bring up the contrast to around 30 or so. And let's increase the strength. I think I had it at around 46. And let's see what we get. All right, so now we are getting something. And the way that this travels is also what's going to drive the vertex map or the wet map that we're going to make now. So I mean, we can play with this, obviously. Maybe up the size a little bit. But I think I'm gonna be happy with this. Now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into this particle group incubated. I'm gonna set them to dots, and just gonna set the color to white so they're not distracting, like so. And that's the main setup for the particles. Now I want these particles or this particle group to drive a wet map. So how can we do that? Well, let's go to sphere outer and I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to say X particles tags. And then let's get a XP wet map. So in the wet map, we need to tell it a few things. First of all, sources. So what's going to drive this wet map? Well, I want to use this group. So let's set this to be the infected particle group. And if I go back to the general tab, so we need to tell it, so we need to push out a vertex map. Which one is that going to be? Well, that's going to be the one that we created at the beginning. Like so. And I'm just going to reduce the sample size to 5. So it samples smaller areas. It blurs it a little bit less. And here's, well, let's just play this, see what we get. If I select the vertex map, we can actually see what's going on. And we're not going to see anything. And this is a bit of a gotcha, because if you go back into the wet map here, there's a render only. So only do this when you go for render time. And this has stumped me a few times when I didn't realize what was going on. You got to uncheck this one. So now if we do the same scenario again, let's select the vertex map. I'm going to see we are actually getting a vertex map. And this is the reason why I wanted to have more segments for this, for the sphere, just so we have higher resolution for the vertex map here. So now let's fix a few things. Now this is way too intense. So I'm going to set down the distance to 1. And this is going to make it a lot more kind of pinpointed for creating the yellow areas. And the strength of this is dictated by the wetness. How wet is it? And I'm going to set this pretty low as well. A 2, maybe a variation of 1 or so. And then fade. Let's just play this back. See the difference here. So it's a lot more subtle. And then the next option, fade, is going to be is how quickly does it dry up. Now, one thing that we could do that I like to do when I work with vertex maps, like so, because we need to look at the vertex map to get a good idea, is we can lock this window. So if I lock this, now I can go back, select this, and we can still make modifications while still having this one active. So if you want this to fade a lot quicker, for example, we could set this to 75, then this is going to go back to red pretty quickly. So now it barely works at all because it goes back to red so quickly. Now I'm going to set fade to 18. And it's just going to set the spread distance to, I think 1 centimeter is fine. And let's see what we get. Yeah, I think that's good. Now, of course, you can play with this for a really long time. And the way I came out with these numbers, test one thing, see what worked, try another, see what didn't work. I mean, that's the only real way to do this. So that's how I came up with this. But now we're going to use this vertex map as a driver when we texture this. So let's set up a couple of things here. First of all, to render this, I need to add a cycles 4D tag to this group. So I'm going to right click and go to cycles 4D tags. And then I am going to add a cycles instance. And also I forgot, I got to unlock this group. So let's go to the cycles instance. And instead of 24 segments for each sphere, let's do 8. So it's a lot lighter to render. I'm going to do a size multiplier of 25 and a size variation of 50. Some are going to be really, really small. And let's just take a look at the other things we have in the file. I have a few materials that we'll go through as we render. But I do have, just on the top here, I have a big softbox. And that softbox has a strength of just 1. It's a fairly blue light and 400 by 400 centimeters. And then I just have a camera. So if I enable this camera, this is the angle. And I have a cycles 4D camera tag on it with a 0.003. And I have a cam rotator. It's just rotating around this circle ever so slightly. So to be honest, this wouldn't be the final shot if I were to render this out. This is just more to show you what it looks like, but I would certainly have a few different angles if I were to render this out for real. But let's hide these and let's go to the Cycles 4D layout. Okay, so this is the Cycles 4D render layout. The nodes are on the left side, real-time previews in the center. And then I have the perspective, objects manager, and the attributes manager in the right column. So let's start with the particles. And if you remember, in the particles group, the infected particles group, we made this black to white gradient random shader or gradient. So that's what we'll use for the particles. So let's add the particles material to this group. And let's just hit play and see what we get. So that's what the particles look like. Now, if I look at the particle setup here, I've added a particle info node, which you can get to if you right click and say input and particle info. And then we have access to all this data, which is fantastic. Now I've taken that black and white gradient and I put that into a color ramp. So these are the colors. And then these colors go into an emission node with a default strength of 1. And then I blended this emission node with a transparent shader. So I'm using the add shader. And that gives these kind of white hotspots, which in general looks pretty nice with particles. And that's really all there is to the particle setup. So next, I want to look at the inner sphere. So I'm going to hide the outer sphere, which is kind of like the crust. But let's take a look at the inner sphere first. I'm going to put this material on the inner sphere, and you can see right away that this looks really, really bright. But let's try to break this down a little bit. Let me go into that node tree. And the first thing I want to do is just to reduce the emission strength. This is really meant to be seen through the outer sphere, which is the crust. And that really takes down the intensity a lot. So let me set this down to just 100 for now, so it's less intense. But now we can see it a lot better what's going on. And inside, this is a volume. So if I look at the output here, this is piped into the volume, not the surface, but the volume. And this is all driven by 3D noise. So I started, if we go to Cycles 4D, we do have a volume section. And I started with a noise volume. And then I added to this. So what creates the volume is this principal volume shader that we have, which is new from the latest release of Cycles 4D. It's a really nice principal volume shader. And I'm piping 3 things in here. I'm piping the density. We have a density port, and then an emission strength, and then the emission color. So what drives all this is basically 2 noises. The first noise here, it's just a scale of 2 and a detail of 16. And if I solo this, we can see what's going on. This is what it looks like. It doesn't have enough contrast to be too visible. But what this one has, it has this option, the 4D option, which is also new from the latest release of Cycles 4D. It gives us the ability to animate this noise, which is pretty fantastic. I love that. So if you look here under the evolution and in the attributes manager, that this is keyframed. So on the first frame, I have it set to 0, and on the last frame, on frame 180, it's just set to 1 evolution. So if I play this back, you may or may not be able to see that, but it is animating. So then I've taken this noise and I put that into a second noise, and that's just to get some more detail. So if I solo that, you can see things a lot better. And then if I play this back now, you can see this a lot better, that this is animated noise. The second one isn't animating, but it is because we have more details now. We can see it a little bit better. And I increased the scale to 8.530 on this one and kept the details at 16. So with these noise textures, I am piping them into ramps to increase contrast. So the first or the bottom ramp here is going to drive the emission and the color. And if I solo that, this is what it looks like. So it's a lot more contrasty. And then one is going into the emission strength, which is controlled with this math slider here. And then the other one is the color, which I just put into a color ramp, which goes into the emission color. And then the second ramp is increasing the contrast for the density. And then it goes into this density math slider. And the higher I go with the density value here, the more dense the noise is going to become. And as I mentioned, this is meant to be seen through the crust of the outer sphere. That's why the intensity is so high. So let's go back to this math node and increase this to 1,000 again. Like so. So next up is the sphere outer. So let me unhide that. And let's put the outer sphere material on that sphere. And I need to put it at the end. And let's take a look at this material. And this is essentially a blend of two different materials. So let's look at them one by one. Let's zoom in here a little bit more. So this is a dark material. I don't know if it's black, not quite black, but it's very dark, 5% on the brightness. And then I've switched this to be a metallic texture. So 1. Now, it doesn't look like much, but I've also added displacement, so which is driven by a noise texture. I just used the texture coordinates so we can get the coordinates for the object. And then I put that into a noise texture. And then put that inside of a color ramp. If I solo that, you can see what it looks like. And then I've piped them into two different math sliders, which I can use if I use actual displacement. Right now, if I select the output, under the material settings, you can see that the displacement method is right now set to bump. But if you want true displacement, you can set this to true or both. But for now, I'm going to leave it at bump. And then I'm going to put this displacement inside of the displacement. And then let's unsolo that. So then we have this kind of bumpy displacement. Now the second material is this transparent material. If I zoom out here a little bit. I wish I had some more space. Okay, so let's put that inside of the surface instead. So this is very transparent. If I look at the options here for the node settings, bring up the space here. So what I've done is I've taken transmission all the way up to 1, and the IOR is 1.33, so it's essentially water. But then what I've done is I am blending between them based on the vertex map that we created before. So the way we can blend now between them is I have a mix shader. I'm going to put the dark material on the top, and I'm going to put the transparent material at the bottom. And now I need to drive this with this factor. And the way we can do that is if I take the vertex map from our outer sphere and just simply drag that in, that's going to create an attribute node for us. Let me zoom in. And if I take the factor now and pipe that in to this factor and put the mix shader into the surface, we now have the vertex map driving which material is showing. And this is pretty cool. So you can see if I play this back, you can see that it's animating on and off. But that's essentially how this is set up. So let me play this back to some frame kind of in the middle. Something like that. And let's play this. Let's get some space. And let's play a few more frames. And let me set up the samples and just leave it at one final frame. Let's do 24 samples. And then I'm going to let this chug along. Okay, so this is the final result. And I mean, you could obviously tweak this in so many different ways, starting with the base noise texture that we are generating the particles from. But I'll leave that to you. And that brings this tutorial to an end. Send me some links if you come up with something cool based on the techniques. And if you found some value, consider subscribing. All the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. I'll see you next time.